Hello, aspiring developer. All right, today we're diving into the nitty-gritty. It's time to start building up the skills that you need to build your software. And this all starts with data structures. Data structures, for me personally, are 80% of the work that you will do. If you can understand the data that you are working with, you can understand your application. And I would say that 80% of understanding your application is understanding the data that goes into it. Because if you know what data you need, that informs the interface that you need for your end user, for your customer, for you. Right? If you don't know what data you need, then you don't know precisely what fields. And this goes the other way too. If you have a rough interface, that gives you a pretty good idea of the information that you need to capture and store for your app. So all of this revolves around data, and all apps essentially help you organize, make it easy for you to input and capture and manipulate or delete data. That's all they do at the end of the day. And then our computers automate it. They do things with that data that we wouldn't necessarily want to do by hand. This is how the world scales. So, to start with data, I want to share with you 4 primitives. So a primitive in coding terms is the foundational building block of data, right? And there are multiple of these, but in the no-code space, you're only going to need to care about 4. I'll say that the last one as well, some coding purists might say that's not a primitive, Sterling, and I agree with you, but I don't really care. You can think of it as a primitive in the no-code space. That's totally fine. It's a foundational building block. So the first one we're going to take a look at is an integer. An integer is a number, specifically a whole number. Right, so computers, if you know anything about them, they think in zeros and ones, and so that's why primitives exist, is so that we can effectively, represent our data, and so that the computer knows how to present it to you, because it's seeing everything as zeros and ones, and so you need these data types so that it can know how to interpret the information you're providing it. And if it doesn't know the data type, then it can't make proper decisions and it can't necessarily help you, right? So integers are whole numbers. And these are going to be used anywhere you're going to need a whole number. If you can think of, let's say, dates, for example. The month, there are 12 months, so you're going to have an integer there. There are a specific number of days. There's a year, right? You generally don't represent a time frame or a date with any decimal point in there. And so integers will be used to represent day, a month, a year, different things like this. So an actual full date might include multiple integers then that are kind of stacked on top of each other to create the date field. So integers are going to be incredibly useful and foundational in pretty much everything that you do, especially as you get into what we call lists or arrays, which will be a more complex data structure that we'll talk about next time. So integers are foundational. You'll be using them pretty much everywhere, from loops, which we will also talk about, to dates, to counting things, to just so many different things. If you have a token, for example, in the app that my brother and I built in Roast Me, we track the number of marshmallows that you have available to you. And as you use up the tokens, they decrease, right? So integers are used everywhere. The next one is a Boolean. This is probably the simplest of all the primitives. This is a checkbox. This is yes or no, yay, nay, checked or unchecked, right? I'm not going to go super far into this. If you've clicked a checkbox on your screen before, you have interacted with what's called a Boolean. And in all of the no-code space and just in programming in general, they call it a Boolean, right? I believe SmartSuite actually does call it a checkbox. That's very nice of them. But in Flutterflow, when you're working with that, it's going to be, it'll actually say Boolean there. So just know that Boolean means yes, no, right? The third one is a float or a double. Now these two words are kind of used interchangeably at this point, but all you need to know about this data type is that it's a decimal. So to give you an example of a difference between an integer and a float, let's say that an integer is 1, -17, 54. A float or a double has a decimal place, so it'd be 1.1, 67.2, 3.1459, right? Pi is a float or a decimal. And so decimals, if you a float or a double, have a decimal point in them. Now, this is going to be useful whenever you have a range, a spectrum, a continuum, right? You're not necessarily looking at an integer anymore, you're looking at breaking it down. Now, I feel like a lot of early stage developers kind of get stuck on when would I use one versus the other. And the first thing I would say is if you don't need to divide the whole number in half, if you don't need a decimal place, don't use the float. It's unnecessary, right? If you don't need the decimal, don't use the float. And this will take practice for you to see when and where you might need one or the other. It just will come to you through trial and error. The third one is what's called a string. Now, a string is any text that you see on the screen in front of you. So if we were to take this entire thing that I've just highlighted, that would be a string. And if I copy it and then I paste it here, I've just pasted that string. So inside of Flutterflow, it'll be called a string. Inside of Smart Suite, they are kind enough to call it text. And in my next video, I'm going to be diving into both Smart Suite and Flutterflow and showing you how to use each of these in the softwares themselves. So a string is probably the most used variable type in existence, I would say, just because they represent everything that pretty much everything that you read on the screen. And like hello world is a very common programming thing that you always do with intro developers. You have them print out hello world. This is a string. This is a string. Data structures, all of that is a string. Right? So strings are very common and you will use them everywhere. So these are the 4 primitives that exist in NoCode, and I highly encourage you to get very, very familiar with them and what they are, so that when you read them, when you read integer, when you read Boolean or float or double or string, right, you don't get confused, and that you know what it's saying when you read it and you're like, got it, I know what that's for. And hopefully when we dive into when to use these and how to actually create them inside of Smart Suite and Flutterflow in the next video, that this begins to make more sense. So those are our primitives, and in our next video we will dive into how to actually create them. Specifically, I'll start with Smart Suite.